Welcome to the Theology in Motion podcast. Join us for conversations about the theology of worship, its practice, culture, and design. The Theology in Motion podcast is by the Center for Worship Leadership, Christ College, Concordia University, Irvine, in California.
Welcome to Theology in Motion. My name is Steve Zank. On behalf of the Center for Worship Leadership, we're glad that you are here. Today we have another edition of what we're kind of calling in-house Behind the Music of the Psalm Library. And we have two of the architects of Psalm 42, The Longest Night, the most recent installation of that library, with us today, Dr. Timothy Saleska and Kip Fox. Dr. Saleska is professor of exegetical theology and dean of ministerial formation at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. He does a lot of work in the Old Testament, but especially he's passionate about the Psalms. And in fact, his most recent publication is a commentary on the Psalms. I think it's the most recent one you've done on the Psalms, the book, Psalms 1 to 50, through the Concordia commentary series. So we're really glad to have him with us today. And then we have Kip Fox. Kip has been leading worship for 20 years, writing songs for many years. He's a nationally recognized artist and a songwriter. He currently serves at St. Luke's Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. And he is, we don't know what the title is for him, but he is a strong leader of the Psalm Library itself. And really glad to have him again on the show today. Thanks, guys, both for being here. Kip, can I start by asking you a question? This is your third Psalm Library song. How's it going with the library so far? What do you think? The third one, and anything new you're learning along the way?
I'm learning there are a lot of great, smart people out there, and it's been awesome. I've been honestly feel honored and privileged to get to work with folks on this stuff and get all sorts of insight, and really just humbled by that. It's been fun the whole way. So, and Dr. Saleska here was no different. Had just a great conversation and back and forth about this tune, and have felt just great encouragement from everyone on these projects. So it's been awesome.
Yeah, awesome. And thank you for your leadership in all this process. Let's get into this one. This one is called the Psalm 42, The Longest Night. So the process started in a way where Kip, you and Dr. Saleska worked together to select this psalm. It's an interesting one. What was the process like deciding which psalm you would pick together?
Yeah, well, I came to Tim with a handful of psalms just that I'd been reflecting on and looking at, and that had some themes that really interested me. And we just ended up landing on Psalm 42 based on that, based on sort of, and he can speak to this, just what we talked about and what he felt would be a strong case to start.
Let me ask, what drew you, if you could recall, or maybe you just think about the psalm as it is now, what drew you in about this particular psalm? Can you remember?
Well, to me, really obviously this is a psalm that we've heard represented in songs of the past and in somewhat recent modern worship music history. We all know or have heard, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after thee, right? That song that I think may have been in the 80s, 90s, 70s, don't quite remember, but it really had a lasting impact and is really a great song. But obviously that sticks out right away when you're reading through this psalm. And then to see this recurring theme of the psalmist asking himself why he is cast down and sort of imploring himself to have faith and to trust was compelling to me, especially when looking, again, to modern worship songs and trying to look for refrains in songs. To see something like a refrain happening so clearly was stuck out at first. And then I think second, all these interesting pictures that are painted throughout the psalm. There's a lot going on that piqued my interest and I was curious about. So that's where it started for me.
Before we get any further in the interview, let's take a moment to hear the song for some context. So please enjoy Psalm 42, The Longest Night.
Just as a deer longs for streams, there is an ache in my soul to see the living God. When will I find my way home? As mornings turn into nights, I've tasted only my tears. My foes are mocking me. Why has he left you here? Why are you downcast, oh my soul? Why such a troubled mind? I will praise and put my hope in my Savior and my God. All of these memories are strong as I cry out in despair. I hear the sounds of the crowd. I see your people in prayer. I used to lead them in song, echo their shouts with my own. I walked with multitudes. Now I walk alone. Why are you downcast, oh my soul? Why such a troubled mind? I will praise and put my hope in my Savior and my God. And the deep calls to deep. All your waves and your breakers fall over me. Your love carries me through the longest night. I sing. Why are you downcast, oh my soul? Why such a troubled mind? I will praise and put my hope in my Savior and my God. Why are you downcast, oh my soul? Why such a troubled mind? I will praise and put my hope in my Savior and my God. In my Savior and my God.
Dr. Saleska, let's talk to you a little bit about this process then. When Psalm 42, as you open it up and started to read, what kind of things did you start to discover? Obviously, you've done this research before, but what was that process like working through that psalm?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I am thankful for the collaboration you guys have allowed me to have, especially with Kip. He did most of the work, let's face this. I was just happy to be a part of it. He's amazingly talented. And it was amazing what he came up with, too. So as we picked the Psalms, this used to be, well, it's still one of my favorites. It used to be my favorite, but I think it's probably number 2 on the list. But the reason that I like it is because it deals with this problem that's a very relevant problem of God's seeming absence or his hiddenness. And what's interesting to me about this psalm is that the speaker of the psalm approaches that problem from different perspectives and works his way through it, especially if you connect Psalm 42 with Psalm 43, which many people do because of the refrain that occurs one more time. So theologically, it just presents some really interesting observations and questions and problems for us to deal with. And that's what has always attracted me. In addition to the things that Kip said, the imagery of the psalm and the unique things like, as Kip said, he talks to himself and gives himself a pep talk. Part of the way that he bridges the gap between himself and God is by relying on his memory. I mean, there's kind of very interesting moves that he does in this psalm that when you look at it, it's pretty unique, I think, amongst the other psalms in the Psalter. So, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. Could you walk us through some of those themes, if you don't mind, and maybe
Sure.
just help walk us through the text a little bit, and
Sure.
what it's like that as you go through the text, how do you start to draw out these themes
Okay.
that Kip can then draw on as a musician?
Sure. I mean, and I'll just briefly kind of go through some things so it doesn't get too hairy here, because we spend hours on it, and I don't want to do that. But in the first part of the psalm, you get a sense of his desire to be with God. And so I always point this out to my students, that he's shaping his faith as this deep desire, and it is much the language of a lover for his beloved, or, you know, that kind of a relationship with this language of, as a deer, so my soul longs for you. And I always ask myself, how closely do I really identify with those lines? And right away, I have to answer, if I'm answering truthfully, not really that carefully. Has my faith been shaped in the same way to have this kind of desire or longing to be with God? And I have to say no. So then I ask myself things like, what does that say about my faith, or the way my desires have been shaped, versus the psalmists, first of all. So when I hear that, then it kind of challenges me to kind of listen in a little more carefully. And the first way that he poses this issue is in that last part of the what in the Hebrew text is the third verse. When will I go and appear before God? A lot of people take that and think, and I mean, rightly or wrongly, they think, well, he's asking to go to heaven, to be with God. All right. If you ask a lot of people what their first reaction to that line is, that's what they're going to be saying. While that's possible, I actually think, given the rest of the psalm, that he's talking about going to the sanctuary, because in Old Testament Israel, remember, God was not just symbolically present in the temple or the tabernacle. He was actually there above the mercy seat. And that's where people went to find their God of grace and mercy. And so the way the rest of the psalm plays out, it sounds like he's in a foreign country or a foreign place far away from Jerusalem and from Zion. And so the problem of God being absent is posed as one of distance, spatial distance. If I can go, I can bridge the gap by coming to the sanctuary, because it's there that I'm going to be able to be with God and celebrate with him. Notice, so that's immediately followed up with the next verse. People say to him all day, "Where is your God?" Mm-hmm. That's a common statement that people make that poses a theological problem about God's absence. It's not that the answer is, oh, well, he's, of course, in Jerusalem. It's that your God doesn't seem to be present for you in this time and place. So it's a theological problem of God's absence. So in the first instance, it's a problem of place. The second one, they pose what's a big theological issue for all of us. Where's your God? If you are really, if your God's so powerful, well, where is he when you need him? So that question I'm interpreting out in the light of kind of its other uses in other parts of Scripture.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Elijah in the prophecies of Baal.
Yeah.
But the other way around, where Elijah asked them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even Christ on the cross, hey, if, you who are who you say are, call your father and get him, come down from the cross and all those kinds of things. So we always have that challenge. God's people have had that challenge. Why? Because we walk by faith and by a promise, not always by sight. And so it becomes an issue when we suffer the same kinds of issues that other people suffer. Hey, where is your God when you need him? He doesn't seem to be present. So then he goes on from there. Notice how he eases the pain that we see in the first part of the Psalter by resorting to his memory. When he used to go with this crowd celebrating to worship his Lord, to the house of God, it says. See, so that's why I understand the issue as a problem of space, first of all, but also the theological problem is in the background. All right? And then he does what Kip noticed is this refrain where he gives himself a pep talk. Why are you so bowed down? And then he counsels himself to hope in God because he's going to yet see him, and salvation is in his presence, see? And so his faith resurfaces in those refrains in the midst of his experience of God's absence, in the midst of his being in a far-off place, when he is threatened by depression and by despair. He makes use of his hope. And then the psalm goes on from there. I don't want to kind of belabor the point, but notice his problem with God's absence goes from where is your God to, in verse 10, why have you forgotten me? So all of a sudden God's absence has an edge to it now that it didn't in the first part of the psalm. And he kind of contemplates that, and then the threat of the enemies rises a little more as you end the psalm, and he ends once again on that refrain of hope. And if you go to Psalm 43, it's worse. Why are you angry at me? See, so he kind of ups the ante, and God's hiddenness or absence presses on him from different ways and different perspectives. And so the question always remains, how am I going to bridge the gap between me and this God in whose presence I find salvation? So that's what I find interesting. I've just given you kind of a shorthand of kind of my working through it, but there you have it.
Yeah, is it fair to say it's like almost like his mountaintop enthusiasm has waned, and now he's in some sort of valley?
Yes. So he goes up. So he has that kind of with the refrains. His face surfaces, and then he goes down in despair, and that happens right in the middle of the psalm, where he has this beautiful moment in which he realizes that the Lord is with him. In that middle of the verses 8, 9, and 10 there, before he goes right back down to that why question.
And in the refrain, is it right? He's saying, in my translation, having before me, I think it's ESV, the refrain is then, why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God.
Yeah. So there is a textual issue with those different refrains that you have to resolve that I can't get into.
Okay.
But yes, again I will praise him, or yet I will praise him. Salvation, and then if you're translating more woodenly, it's salvation is in his presence. So you can kind of go there's more than one way to take it, because there are some issues there.
Yeah, and so maybe that's part of that feeling distance, why that is such a scary thing. Yeah,
correct, yeah. And so it's challenging me all along, where am I in my relationship with God? Is he present in my life? And so where do I how do I bridge that gap between me and the God who is for me, who offers his salvation? Those kinds of questions.
Were any of these themes inspired by the church's experience in 2020, 2021 with the COVID situation? Because that's where something that resonated with me when I heard this, Kip's rendition, was that sense of I used to lead this procession in the house of God, but now I feel distant from it.
Yeah.
Did you guys think about that at all in your experience with this psalm? The idea that in COVID, a lot of us were separated from going into church and gathering as a people.
Well, it definitely
ahead,
came to mind. I wouldn't say that we chose it because of it, but it certainly made it a little more poignant to tackle this, and to especially those verses, which is something we can talk about a little bit too when we get into the song and what went into each decision. But yeah, I mean, it was very real, very tangible thing to understand, given the situation we were in. We kind of wrote this over the course of last year, so I guess maybe beginning in the fall. So it's kind of perfect timing with that, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. It is they came together at the same time. It was almost serendipitous.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't planned, but it worked out. Dr. Saleska, any other thoughts about the process of then delivering these themes and helping Kip see these themes that you're bringing out through textual study? Anything else come to mind you want to bring up?
Well, I think that one of the things that I like about what Kip did as we worked through the lyrics is capture for what is for me in this psalm, this sense of longing and this sense of need that I've tried to bring out this way. I think in reference to your last question about the coronavirus, for us who believe in an omnipotent, almighty God, God has his hand in this. So when God is besieging us this way, where do we go for hope? What do we do with a God like that? And we have kind of a particular answer we give. And the psalmist goes to the promises that God has given him, that he has manifested already in the sanctuary, in which he promises, hey, there's forgiveness for your sin. Here's where you're going to find mercy. Here's where you're going to find life with me. And so there's kind of particular movements in light of the coronavirus that I think the psalm makes very relevant. And the song that Kip wrote kind of begins to cry into that situation, cry into that need that we have.
So the longing we feel for this presence, or for this forgiveness, for a sense of connection, that you kind of driving us back to the place where his presence is, I guess is what I hear you saying. Mm-hmm. In the Old Testament, that was at the temple in Jerusalem. And for Christians today, many people find that the presence of God is especially in the sacraments that he gives. Other theological traditions, like Pentecostal traditions, would see that in at least partially the experience of worshiping together.
Yeah.
So I think no matter what tradition you come from, not being able to gather together as a church does sort of feel like a separation from the gifts that God wants to give his church.
Yeah.
So that's a very real...
that's true. For us, that move is from Old Testament place to New Testament person. So, Jesus calls himself destroy this temple in 3 days I will raise it, referring to himself, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so that's why our sacramental theology develops from that, and our understanding of worship as God being present in word and sacrament and us gathering around it. It's kind of interesting when you look at how these themes that the psalm brings out find their way into our traditional hymns all over the place. And our desire to be with God kind of comes out in a number of places that show me that the themes are really part of our traditional way of thinking about our relationship with God. And finally our hope, right? What do we hope? We actually hope that we're going to see him face to face, that the distance gap is going to be bridged actually quite physically. And so it's interesting that I think Christians could use some refocusing that way in what is our hope really? What is the gospel really promising us?
It's almost like it's not just a way to get the things that we want, but it's a much deeper connection with the living God.
Right.
So then, as Kip and Dr. Saleska are working together, walking through the text of the actual psalm, and the Hebrew of the psalm actually sounds like it's bringing out some really interesting approaches. Like, for example, you focused on the idea in this conversation that the salvation is connected to the presence in the Hebrew. A case could be made for that. Are there any other particular insights that you get from reading it in Hebrew as opposed to English?
So I would think, I ask my question, what kind of God is the psalmist giving you in each part of the psalm, or how does he start to picture God? So notice at the first, he pictures God as this kind of, in an intimate way, right? I mean, just the language, as a deer pants for water, so my soul thirsts for you. That, the language of intimacy there through the first part of the psalm. I remember when I would go with this thronging crowd to the house of the Lord. But as you move through, notice that as this edge, why have you forgotten me, God? He takes on he starts to think about it in more foreboding terms, so to speak. God becomes more distant or transcendent, maybe, until notice 43 verse 1, judge me, O God, and plead my cause against a nation, an impious nation. See, so now God is pictured in a very different way than he was at the first part of Psalm 42. And the psalmist then actually kind of adjusts when he says, send your light and your truth, they will guide me, they will lead me. All of a sudden, he wants the gap bridged by God's light and truth, these abstractions. So what does that mean? No, it's very interesting in our hymnals. What do we call light and truth? How do we fill those abstractions with some kind of a content? So the psalmist is in a very different place when he gets to Psalm 43, verse 42, versus what is my hope? See, so we hope when we talk about God's light and truth, we talk about it in terms of the Holy Spirit enlightening us, giving us wisdom to understand the truth. And we're led by faith by these to where we can find God, or to kind of our final hope. So again, the whole thing is this whole continuum of perspectives that keep coming.
Yeah. That very first verse in English, the idea that your soul longs for something.
Yeah.
And is that in Hebrew? Is that a sense of the whole person, the entire being? The word for soul.
So the Hebrew word nephesh refers to the center of our identity, the seat of our appetites and our emotions, what makes us us. So it's not. We shouldn't think Platonic, disembodied soul, but more in that holistic term, right?
Yeah. So Kip, let's turn to you and some of these questions, and as you start to kind of receive this text and think it through on this level, what kind of images started to stand out to you, and how did you decide to move forward with the actual poetics of a song?
Yeah, so all of these things, obviously, Tim gave just as much on, if not more, and so it was really helpful. I've got these themes going. To be honest, I think there were a couple of. So I kind of developed questions too as this goes along, and even before sort of hearing from Tim, to say, okay, just as a lay person reading this, what sticks out to me, and how am I going to tackle this? So in terms of verse 1, for instance, the idea of my soul longing for God, that's not something that's hard to decide how to represent necessarily. One of the things that stuck out to me and I wanted to address was this this idea of, in verse 3, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God, right? Which we've talked about. A lot of times in trying to write the Psalms, we see a lot of, I see a lot of this idea of enemies or foes that are against the psalmist. And it's kind of tough, I think, sometimes in our context, maybe in our American Christian context, to see maybe sort of outside foes attacking our faith. And so I wanted to kind of digest that and see how we could think about that in different terms. And it was helpful, Dr. Saleska, I remember him saying something to the effect that the physical enemies of God can signify forces opposed to God of all kinds. And so that sort of helped me say, okay, how do I take it out of maybe a specific enemy that's working against me and put it into sort of this forces opposed. And so to me, that second part of the first verse was a big part of that. And so what the line that ended up coming up with is, why has he left you here? And we've talked about that a little bit already. And really these, to me, when you talk about COVID, you talk about going through that whole ordeal. I mean, I can identify with, I think we all can identify with these voices in our head, whether it's a specific enemy or it's the enemy or it's our own lies that we're hearing in our head, that we've been left alone, right? And to me, I can identify with that. And that theme, again, as Dr. Saleska said, runs through the entire psalm. So that was one of the first obstacles for me to overcome, was to say, can I communicate? I'm not sure I necessarily did, but can I communicate that sort of general feeling that is sort of that lie that we are left alone? Can I use that while still representing that what the psalmist is saying?
Such an interesting approach, because I feel like the original, at least in the English that I have before me, says, where is your God? But I also like the way that this idea of why have you left me here, or why has he left you here, that kind of plays into the idea that the psalmist is having to kind of give himself a pep talk in a way. Because that's the kind of statement that rings in your head, doesn't it? When someone kind of says that to you, and then you think, well,
totally.
You start to
absolutely. And I think
that a bit, don't
another
you?
big part of that with that statement was the emphasis that Tim had given me on this geographical thing that seems to be happening within the psalm. So there's this physical, literal being left somewhere that is not in God's sanctuary or with God's people, that we feel for sure, and at the same time the spiritual, which we feel really deeply as well, and those two are connected in us all the time. So.
And I noticed that in this psalm rendition, or the song based upon Psalm 42, however you want to say what it is, it's probably one of the more literal versions I've seen you do so far. It seems like as you look at the text of the song and the text of the psalm, you see a pretty close parallel. Like, for example, let's talk about the chorus a little bit. The chorus of the psalm and your chorus, Kip, how did you work through bringing that to life? Because when you look at it, it's almost the same, but there are some changes.
Well, that one's
how did you go through that
just
process?
seemed to happen pretty easily. I mean, to me, it's such a two-part statement, and so to make that into the chorus, makes sense. And so the way that the chorus sounds is a little bit more hopeful than those first couple of lines. Again, we talk about it in terms of a pep talk, really. That was one where it just didn't seem like there was too much work that needed to be done to translate or to make that more poetic than it already was. And it really just, everything is kind of the entire psalm both the pain and the hurt and the sort of far awayness that's felt, as well as the desperate hope that we all put and our faith and trust in God, was all encapsulated in that one section. So it felt like, okay, this is not much work here to do other than to try to put it in a way that's singable.
Yeah. What was the most challenging section for you?
Probably verse 2. Verse 1, just with having "as the deer pants for the water" in my head from childhood, made that tough. But verse 2 was kind of an interesting one because I thought it's really compelling, the pictures that are painted there, and to me, I really identified with this idea, which I took from verse 4, right? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. So, I mean, the imagery there is so strong, and I identified it with a lot just from thinking back to those days of my youth, right? That childlike faith I remember being just having great summers in college as a Christian camp counselor, and attending youth gatherings, leading worship for all sorts of exciting ministries, right? But then also going through seasons in life where those moments, those times, those seasons of great community and just unwavering faith seem so far off and so distant. So to me, I really wanted to capture that. But at the same time, just thinking corporately, thinking about folks singing this song as a group, I worried and wondered if I'd be leaving out a certain part of the population, a certain group of folks that maybe didn't have those same experiences or don't have a long faith life to draw back from. So I worried about whether or not that would be the way to go, but just ultimately decided that it was just kind of too fun of an idea to go after. So that took a while, and it just took a while to take essentially verse 4 there and make 8 lines out of it in a way that communicated what I wanted it to. So that was tough, but also kind of the most rewarding once it got to that point.
Yeah, you could see the work that went in and how successful it was. Back when I was taking classes on how to preach, Dr. Schmidt was my professor, and he was teaching us about preaching. And one thing is about images. He said, if you take an image, you can put it in different places and it means different things. So, like, think about the image like a picture that says, "The Lord is my shepherd." And you put that in a schoolroom and it means one thing. And you put that in a hospital room with someone dying and it means a whole different thing. And I thought about this with this verse 2. When you put this in the mouth of a worship leader, you know what I mean? When a worship leader, as they're leading God's people in song, they sing that as they're saying, "I used to lead them in song, but now I walk alone." That worship leader who's leading the song is welcoming us into an experience of authenticity, especially in a culture where sometimes our singing and worship needs to be only the expression of our exuberant praise in some cultures. But here you provided us an opportunity to sing, meaningfully say, sometimes I don't always feel it. And sometimes I'm singing these songs and I'm in the valley.
Yeah,
I'm not really there anymore.
Again,
it's interesting to me.
Again, what made that particular verse tough was just the decision to say, we're going to stay with the particular emotion here and picture here, regardless of whether or not that might, not be general enough for today's, modern worship scene, if you will. So, and I think a lot of times you'll see in psalm representations which are, many are just done really beautifully, that outside sources or new ideas will be brought in, other scripture, which is great, will be brought in to help sort of put the psalm in the right frame so that we can all sing it without people sort of being left out. And so hopefully sticking with it here creates maybe a new perspective, a fresh perspective that just sticks closer to the psalm. I did feel like this time around, I did question it. I questioned, okay, really sticking closely to the text here in terms of just what we're going to represent lyrically, will that limit the use of this song? But hopefully it makes it unique in a way that is refreshing. I don't know.
Can I follow up on something Kip said? So what I really like about that verse, all these memories are strong as I crowd in despair, that it's in the midst of his despair that his memories come. And I think that captures the psalm. These things I will remember, and I will pour out upon myself my nephesh, my soul, for lack of a better word. So that pouring out upon yourself these emotions of despair and sadness and feelings of absence, the memory comes in, and it's a positive memory. And so I think that verse captures that. It's not as if it dispels all the despair. I kind of liken it sometimes to a prisoner of war, and very often when they're finally rescued, they'll have this worn picture of their wife or their girlfriend. And they'll say, that kept me alive. Not because it's substituted for the real presence of your wife or your girlfriend, but because it was a way for the memory to help them cope in the midst of great pain. And so I think that that's one of the beauties of the psalm that was captured in especially that verse, those next two verses.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I want to add too, Kip, I think that idea of leading in song and echoing shouts, I think for some people it'll seem literal. And I think for others it'll seem like they'll understand the metaphor for them. You know what I mean? Even if they're not leading, they know what it means to
and I think the
be in,
just,
be all in. I think you really
necessarily saying, I was always leading, but it is just that idea of almost like I was the first in line to be singing and shouting because of the strength of my faith. And where has that gone?
Do you think he's referring to the Songs of Ascent? Do you think he's referring to the pilgrimage into Jerusalem when he says that in the psalm? To lead them in procession.
I leave
to the
that
house
to the
of
scholars,
God.
really, on this one. So
I don't know.
I don't know. Could be. Maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Well, there's one section I'm really curious about, and that's the bridge. The deep calls to deep. I feel like that I've heard that in a lot of different songs. The one that came to mind most recently was all who are thirsty, all who are weak come to the fountain. And I thought, that's interesting because it's also this idea of thirsting. Then is the chorus of that song, Kip, that says, the deep goes out to deep, the pre-chorus. But here in this psalm, in the way that you've written this song, the bridge talks about this deep calling out to deep, calls to deep. What does that mean?
Well, I'll let Dr. Saleska kind of unpack that. It's obviously, it's one of those phrases that sounds very pretty, so we all like to use it, but we did have a conversation about that because I didn't want to just throw that out there because it sounded nice. But Dr. Saleska, we talked about maybe verse 6 and 7 there.
Yeah. So, okay, I mean, it's really interesting you picked that up, and I think Kip, in just this very concise language, kind of got the gist of it. A lot of people interpret that section as metaphorical waves, so that he's deep in sorrow. But at least one interpreter, and I totally agree with this, has this idea that no, he's actually talking about the literal waves and breakers of water that if you ever travel to North Israel, to the northern Israel, to Dan, if you follow the Jordan River up to its headwaters, that's where you'll see waterfalls and cataracts. And Mount Hermon is in the distance, which is mentioned earlier. And when you look at the language in this section and compare it with earlier, with the language of the him with the throngs of people, the language mirrors it. It used some of the same language. So deep calls to deep. The Hebrew language there reflects the same thing. And so notice that the only the place in the psalm where he actually is engaging in acts of worship is right here. Because notice what he comes to. Yahweh commands his chesed, his grace to me by day, and at night his song is with me, prayer to the living God. So notice that he realizes, I think, that though he's not in the sanctuary, his God is present there, and he hears in nature them praising Yahweh, praising the Lord. And he's reminded of God's grace. And the idea is then that he can see when he uses prayer and song and grace. See, that's where he's at the high point. He realizes, even here God is present. Even here we can worship him. And then he plunges, of course, back into despair. But see, in that section, and the deep calls to deep, all your waves and your breakers, they wash over me. And then then just that simple line, your love carries me through the longest night I sing, to me kind of captures in one verse that kind of the point of that part of the psalm. Yeah. So that it's not, I don't see that as him talking about his despair with the waves. I take those waves literally as nature and worship, as so many other psalms talk about how creation praises the Lord.
So in a sense, he's remembering also creation's worship, and creation's encouraging him. Yeah.
His song is with me, and a prayer to the living God. Oh, okay, that's kind of a high point for him, and he realizes, his worship isn't God is present even there in his grace and mercy. So it's kind of this really interesting move, I think.
Yeah, and right here in the bridge we have the title of the song. It's such an interesting choice because you think about the song and the chorus. There's options, but this choice to use this line from the bridge, through the longest night, seems to really capture this sense of memory, of the pep talk to yourself. To look ahead to the morning and to remember the past. It's really, really quite beautiful. Any thoughts about the bridge? Any more thoughts about the bridge?
No, I mean, again, those are the tools I had to go on, and so I felt like the confidence to do that. There is just a sense in which I'd love to explain more if we had more lines and more time. But hopefully, it does capture what you're talking about. And I think hopefully too, encapsulates the psalm, which is why maybe choosing that for the title was the way to go. I think there's just we see so much anxiety these days from folks. Anxiety is the word of the 2020s, I guess you could say. And so I think this psalm, really can represent a long night for a lot of folks. We've had a lot of those long nights these last couple of years. So, I don't know what that means, but.
No, it encourages us. I think it gives us resources to deal with those long nights and to speak into those long nights and to remember things. Sometimes we're encouraged to just to move on.
Right.
Or to dismiss that we're feeling that way. But the psalmist and what you've done here, it encourages us that we can do something. We can sing through the longest night I can sing. That's pretty interesting. So with the time left that we have, any other thoughts about the poetics? I did want to say one thing you're talking about a second ago, Kip, and I realized in this conversation, Dr. Saleska, in his work on this psalm, in his edition, I bet does a lot of work to using a lot of words to kind of draw out all this meaning and make it very clear. And in some ways, what you're doing here is a similar thing, but you're trying to artistically use less words, and kind of encapsulate everything. And that's why I love this conversation. That's kind of what we're doing, I think, is we're kind of zooming in to then to zoom out again and to appreciate the poetics that you've chosen. Anything about that generally before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really
or
great observation.
The choice of words.
Because what I'm looking for from Dr. Saleska is as much content as possible, as many words as possible to help me understand and break down what's going on. And really what that ends up doing is just giving me confidence to use my own words based on what I've got, right? So that's probably the biggest obstacle for me. A lot of times in writing worship music, or especially drawing from the Psalms, is the confidence that I'm communicating what's being communicated, and that I'm representing what Scripture says, and preaching the good news with what I write, without any distraction or without any error. So with that confidence and foundation, on top of these nuggets of great wisdom that I would not get on my own, or without years of study, really is what helps write the song. So yeah.
Let me ask a question about the actual performance then of the piece. When you went to the studio and you were tracking it, were there any vocal techniques you were trying to draw from, or when you actually presented the song then in recorded format, were any kind of considerations being brought in to the performance aspect of it?
The way that the melody is structured, really that's more of a writing choice. I wanted it to be a simple chorus. There's certainly some ways in which this doesn't check all the boxes with what sort of our modern ears are looking for, right? When it comes to maybe popular music of a certain style, but I wanted to make sure that there was something singable that wasn't overly syncopated. And then going into the studio and working on it, we definitely had a choice between sort of making this a slow ballad, or making this something that had a different energy to it. And so we kind of we ended up going back and forth, but making the decision that, I've seen some examples recently of songs like this that deal with some tough realities, that deal with pain and anxiety, and it's my general reaction is to always go to the sort of sad ballad way of representing that. But we made the decision to keep this, give this an emotional power that was somewhat defiant, just like the refrain is, to say, yes, these things are troubling me, but I'm going to sing it and even perform this in a way that is confident. So that was certainly an aspect that we decided to chew on.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like you could
right,
personify either side of the person's experience, right? Because he's giving himself a pep talk, which means there's a part of him that feels one way, and there's another part of him that's encouraging that part. So it's interesting how you chose to, in this rendition, you chose to capture this other side that's saying, hey, you can trust in God.
Yeah, and go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
I'm a non-musician, so it fascinates me how you came up with the melody, just this talk here. Just could you just for a guy like me, give me an insight into your minds? I mean, do you guys toss melodies in and out, or I mean, does something come to you?
Yeah,
I'm just really fascinated.
Yeah,
so I have no idea.
The chorus was just kind of easy in terms of a lot of times for me, there are different folks that start with melody or lyric. I'm definitely going to start with a lyric guy, and so melodies are kind of attached to how I hear a lyric sounding or how I hear the word sounding. So the chorus that melody kind of just came from how I would speak it or how I would feel it. But the melody for the verse this time around came somewhat from a chord progression that I really was feeling and really liked, and then the melody kind of came from there, and I knew that I really needed to then fit syllabically what I needed to say into that melody. So this one kind of had both things going on, but there was sort of this haunting melody with the chord progression that I just felt fit the song that I was hearing. So it's hard to say how those things happen other than,
interesting.
But I would say too that I take my time with these. So, I try not to force the issue and come up with something quickly. And so the melody for the verse especially was kind of unique for me. And it, in a way, then it becomes a little bit of a challenge to not make it too much of a mouthful to sing to that melody and all that. But that's kind of how it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, seeing the chart, I think some of the verses has a very particular chord changes going on,
right?
That aren't necessarily standard. Don't have to say it that way. And I think those non-standard choices in the verse elicit in composition certain styles of singing that maybe are feel like home. They're more interesting. They're more contemplative. It's like in when you sing tones in liturgy, the tone you use for the gospel reading is like rooted in the one, like it feels like a home, and the tone you use for the epistle reading is like more like mysterious feeling and sounding. I think you do the same thing here with this, and I might be wrong, but I think the chorus then is more standard, and so you juxtapose this kind of non-standard musical choice into the chorus, into a very standard musical choice. I think that does some of it, because if you swapped it, it would feel weird, right? If the chorus was the non-standard and the verse was standard, it wouldn't feel the same.
There's a very standard, stable aspect to the chord changes in the chorus, and that's why I had said you picked up on that, Steve. It really kind of started with the chord changes for me in terms of the verse. It started with these unique changes that I felt were sort of a couple of Beatles tunes that stuck out to me. Not that I'm approaching that at all, but I just felt like, oh, this is a cool. I like the way that this creates that uncertainty, that instability, and then what would you say? Juxtaposed against just that really simple, confident chorus.
I think that's probably enough. Does that help, Dr. Saleska? That's a great question.
Hey, man, that is more than I bargained for. That's awesome. It's really cool to hear how you guys. I know you guys are both musicians that are so awesome to hear you actually talk with a deep knowledge of music that I don't have. I mean, it's kind of like you make these moves kind of because you're such a knowledge of. It's just like a surgeon knows how to cut because they've had so much experience.
Yeah, and it's too bad with Adam really Countryman who helped with this as well. I'm just a guy that just starts playing the chords and writes the lyrics to it. But he would tell us that what the 2-5-1 to the 6 major happening in the verse, what that is, where who's done it and all that jazz. So.
Great. Well, let me ask this question, if you're willing to share. If you're willing to, as far as willing to share, what in particular did this psalm and this song mean to you as you meditate on it? I know Dr. Saleska shared some of that already, but maybe just in closing, help us bring out some of the meditative kind of devotional aspect of this.
To me, I struggle with the presence of God, the absence of God all the time. And so to me, I oftentimes use my memories, use the ways that God has brought me through in the past to solidify my faith, to encourage my faith. And I've had several long nights. So to me, I just love what Psalm 42, just the honest language it brings to faith in God, and how it's really not hard for me at all to identify with that. So, yeah.
Then good. Thank you both for joining me today. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the work that you did on the psalm. If you want to hear Psalm 42, The Longest Night, it's available, I think, anywhere you can listen to music. I think Spotify, those kind of places. If you find our YouTube channel, which if you're watching this on a video, you're probably already there. Or if you're on the podcast, go ahead and look up on YouTube, Psalm 42, The Longest Night. You'll be able to see the video of the song and other resources from the Center for Worship Leadership. So thank you again for joining us today. Dr. Saleska and Kip, really appreciate you both. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Theology in Motion with Dr. Tim Saleska and Kip Fox. If you enjoyed this episode, let's invite you to check out our other shows on our podcast network, How the Soup is Made and On the Ground Floor. If you enjoyed this rendition of Psalm 42 and are looking for some resources, go to our website, cwlonline.org. You can download charts and other resources for this installment of the Psalm Library and past installments. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next month.